The morning air clung heavy over the Tower of London. Mist rose from the stones as though the fortress itself exhaled centuries of blood. Soldiers stood silent. No crowd roared, no rebels marched. Instead, a frail woman of 67 was led across the green. Her name was Margaret Pole, the last Plantagenet. She had committed no crime but the one written in her veins: royal blood, a lineage that stretched back farther than the Tudors who condemned her. For 2.5 years she had rotted in a cold cell. The Crown said she was guilty of treason, yet no trial was held, no witnesses called. Her fate had been sealed by an act of Parliament that obeyed the King's paranoia more than justice. On this morning, the sentence would finally be carried out. But what awaited her was not the swift stroke of an executioner's blade. It was something far darker, a spectacle of horror so clumsy and brutal that it scarred even the savage memory of Tudor England. Margaret was not born for such an end. She entered the world in 1473 as Margaret Plantagenet, daughter of George, Duke of Clarence, brother to Edward IV. Her family belonged to the old royal house of York, a bloodline tied to centuries of kings. Her childhood was shaped by whispers of betrayal and downfall. Her father, remembered in dark rumor as the man drowned in a butt of wine, was executed when she was only a girl. Her uncles, Edward IV and Richard III, wore the crown in turn. Her heritage was heavier than gold and far more dangerous. For when the Wars of the Roses ended and the Tudor dynasty seized power, the children of Clarence remained as shadows on the throne, living symbols of a claim that could never be erased. Henry VII, founder of the new dynasty, understood this threat. He wove a crown of marriage and conquest, binding the houses of York and Lancaster. Yet Margaret lived always as a reminder that the blood of Plantagenet still pulsed in England. Her youth was marked not by splendor but by careful survival. She married Sir Richard Pole, a man of loyalty to the Tudors, and through that union she gained safety. But her blood, her name, her ancestry, were shackles she could never lay down. When Henry VIII ascended the throne, Margaret's fortunes changed. Unlike his father, he restored her titles. He named her Countess of Salisbury, returned vast estates, and raised her among the nobility once more. She was appointed governess to his daughter Mary, a mark of trust and intimacy. For years she stood near the heart of the court. She was respected, even admired. And yet, beneath every gift, the danger of her heritage remained. The storm broke not through Margaret but through her son, Reginald Pole, educated, brilliant, a man whose voice carried across Europe. In the 1530s, when Henry VIII broke from Rome to take Anne Boleyn as his wife, Reginald defied him. He denounced the king in writings that spread like fire. He called Henry a heretic, a tyrant, a man who had betrayed the church. This was no common insult. It was treason from the pen of a Plantagenet, a man of royal blood whose words might inspire rebellion. Henry's rage was immediate, and his vengeance certain. Reginald lived beyond his reach in Europe, but the king could strike his family. Margaret's sons fell first. Arrests, accusations, executions. The Pole family was crushed one by one beneath the king's wrath. Margaret herself was too prominent to simply drag to the scaffold. She had once been close to his queen, Catherine of Aragon. She was revered as a noblewoman of high rank. So Henry turned to the tool that cloaked tyranny and legality, an act of attainder. In November 1538, Parliament declared Margaret guilty of treason. No trial was heard, no defense allowed, no witness stood in her favor. The king's word alone was proof enough. She was stripped of her lands, her titles, her fortune. At 65, she was dragged to the Tower of London and locked in its stone belly. For 2 years she endured. The tower was a prison not of days but of endless waiting. Its walls were damp, its air heavy with silence. The knowledge of her fate was torture in itself. The wheel of Henry's paranoia turned ceaselessly, and yet no execution date came. She grew old in the shadow of the axe, a living reminder of a monarchy that Henry could never wholly extinguish. Then, in the spring of 1541, the silence ended. The order came. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, widow, mother, grandmother, and the last of the Plantagenets, was to die. On May 27th, she was led from her cell. Her hair had turned white, her frame was frail, yet her eyes were said to burn with defiance. She walked slowly to the Tower Green, where so many noble heads had fallen. But the stage prepared for her was unlike the rest. The appointed executioner was absent. In his place stood a young man, inexperienced, nervous, with an axe that seemed heavier than his arms could command. Margaret was told to kneel. Witnesses claimed she refused. She was 67, worn by years of confinement, yet she found strength to speak. If they wanted her head, they would have to take it by force. She would not bow willingly to Henry's will. What followed was not execution but slaughter. The first blow struck her shoulder. She cried out, stumbled, and tried to flee. A woman of 67, bleeding, staggering across the grass, pursued by the headsman's blade. The crowd watched in horror as blow after blow fell, 11 in all, hacking her to pieces before at last the body collapsed. Even in Tudor England, a land accustomed to the theater of death, this scene chilled the blood. It was not justice, nor ceremony, but butchery. Rumors spread that Henry never spoke her name again. Some chroniclers whispered that her death haunted him, that it fed the shadows of paranoia that consumed his final years. Yet Margaret did not vanish. Rome declared her blessed, a martyr who died for faith and lineage. Her death, meant to erase her bloodline, only enshrined her as a symbol of endurance against tyranny. Henry's name is remembered in infamy, hers in defiance. Her execution is more than a tale of one woman's end. It is a mirror of power unbound, of a monarch's fear made flesh in violence. Margaret Pole's blood soaked the stones of the tower. But her story bleeds through centuries, a reminder of what it costs when justice is abandoned to the will of kings. The tower had seen many deaths before hers. Kings, queens, rebels, and innocents alike. Anne Boleyn had walked to her fate only 5 years earlier, her end remembered for its cruel elegance beneath the sword of a Frenchman. Margaret's death was the opposite, a spectacle of chaos that stripped even the grim dignity from execution. It was as though Henry's vengeance demanded not only her life, but her humiliation. By the 1540s, Henry himself had declined. The Prince of Promise was gone, replaced by a swollen body crippled by ulcers, his temper violent, his mind consumed by suspicion. Beneath the velvet and gold lived a king who trusted no one. Friends became traitors overnight. Wives were cast aside or destroyed. Ministers rose high only to fall to the axe. The wheel of fortune spun endlessly, and Margaret, despite her years, was dragged beneath it. Her death must be seen not as an isolated cruelty, but part of a pattern. Henry feared enemies both real and imagined. He broke from Rome to command the church. He crushed monasteries, seized their wealth, and declared himself supreme head of faith. To resist him was treason. To question him was death. Yet even with all power in his hands, he could not silence the fear that rival blood still lived. Margaret was the last thread of Yorkist claim. Her son Reginald, a cardinal in the Catholic Church, lived in safety abroad. Henry's rage burned at his defiance, and unable to touch the son, he struck the mother. Margaret was not forgotten or obscure. She was a countess once trusted by the king and beloved by his daughter. Her fall showed England that no rank, no loyalty, no memory of service could withstand suspicion. Whispers later claimed she prayed as the axe fell, or cried out in defiance. Yet most of these tales were legend. What cannot be denied is the horror of the act itself. Contemporary accounts spoke of the headsman's panic, of Margaret stumbling, of 11 blows raining down before her body collapsed. This was not justice, it was chaos, a scar upon the very stones of the tower. Her memory did not fade. Rome raised her as a martyr. The church declared her blessed centuries later. To the faithful, she was a woman who died for loyalty and faith, condemned not for deeds, but for the blood she carried. Henry, by contrast, passed into history as a tyrant. His paranoia had not preserved his dynasty, but darkened its legacy. Even in his own time, unease lingered. The brutality of her end was whispered in halls and recorded in chronicles. It became a tale of a fallen noblewoman and of a king's descent into cruelty. England itself trembled, its monasteries stripped, its nobles wary. its faith divided. The axe that struck her was more than a weapon. It was the edge of a kingdom fractured by suspicion and blood. Her story endures in silence as much as in words. Tower Green still holds the memory of that morning. Visitors pause before the small monument marking the spot of noble blood, often unaware of her name, yet sensing the shadow that clings to the place. Even in an age where death was spectacle, some killings were too monstrous to forget. Her death is a warning. Power without restraint consumes even those it once favored. Restored by the king, honored, trusted, yet all of it ashes when fear demanded her blood. The Plantagenet name was nearly extinguished with her, but memory kept it alive. Margaret Pole's end became not only the destruction of a woman, but the indictment of a king. She faced it not in submission, but with the defiance of her lineage. Margaret's story was shadowed by rumor long before the axe was raised. Her father, George, Duke of Clarence, was remembered in grotesque legend as the man drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine. Many believe this was palace gossip rather than truth, yet the tale endured, staining his daughter's name with the memory of strangeness and betrayal. Her uncle Richard III lived in the same twilight of history and rumor. Some said he was a rightful king cut down at Bosworth. Others branded him the usurper who murdered his nephews in the Tower. Margaret carried this legacy of suspicion, born into a family whose name was both royal and cursed. Later, whispers followed her at court. Servants claimed she corresponded with her son Reginald, the cardinal who defied Henry from abroad. Others accused her of blessing rebels who rose in the north. None of it was ever proven. Historians today see these charges as rumor rather than evidence, but for Henry they were excuse enough. In Margaret, myth and bloodline blurred into threat, and the axe was sharpened to silence her. By the time Margaret's blood stained the grass of the Tower, Henry's reign had entered its twilight. The king who once dazzled Europe with his athleticism and charm now lived in a body that betrayed him. His leg, torn by an old jousting wound, festered with ulcers that never healed. His once slender frame swelled with weight until he could barely walk without assistance. The gilded armor of his youth no longer fit, and the king hid his pain behind velvet, gold, and rage. His paranoia had grown with his infirmity. Ministers who had once guided him fell one after another. Thomas More, loyal in service yet steadfast in faith, had died upon the scaffold. Thomas Cromwell, architect of Henry's power, would soon meet the same fate. Wives were cast aside like pawns, some dismissed with humiliation, others destroyed with steel. The circle around him narrowed until trust became impossible. In this fever of suspicion, Margaret Pole became the embodiment of all he feared. She had royal blood. She had ties to Rome through her son. She had lived long enough to remember the Yorkist crown. In her veins lay the memory of rival kings. To Henry, this was intolerable. His dynasty was young, uncertain, and fragile. Yet his enemies seemed to multiply with each passing year. To extinguish Margaret was to extinguish a symbol. But in doing so, he revealed the weakness of his own rule. When the axe fell 11 times upon her body, it was not only her life that ended. It was the mask of justice. In earlier years, Henry had cloaked his brutality in trials, however false, or in ceremonies that carried the illusion of law. Anne Boleyn had been condemned by charges however invented. The Carthusians who resisted him were sentenced in formal courts. But with Margaret, even that veil was abandoned. She was condemned by an act of parliament that offered no evidence, no defense, no voice. Her death was not law, it was raw will. The sight of her butchery lingered in the minds of those who saw it. Even hardened courtiers recoiled at the spectacle of an old woman hacked down in clumsy blows. Chroniclers wrote of it in tones of horror, as though the king had crossed a line that even Tudor England could not stomach. In silence, the story spread, whispered in chambers and carried in letters. Henry, so eager to erase her, had instead made her unforgettable, and perhaps he knew it. After her death, he never spoke her name. The silence of the king was itself an admission. He had sought to break her line, but in breaking her, he had revealed the corruption of his own. His final years were marked by isolation, fury, and fear. The body that once strode in tournaments now collapsed under its own weight. His face, once the image of majesty, was twisted by disease. His court grew weary, his people restless, his enemies abroad emboldened. He died in 1547, 6 years after Margaret, remembered not as the Golden Prince, but as a tyrant who devoured even those who had once stood at his side. Margaret, by contrast, rose in memory. The Catholic Church declared her blessed, her death honored as martyrdom. In paintings and prayers, she was remembered as a noblewoman who stood firm against injustice. Where Henry was cursed as a despot, Margaret was revered as a victim of tyranny. Her legacy outlived the dynasty that destroyed her. Her story is not merely of one execution. It is the story of a monarchy corroded by suspicion, of a ruler who mistook power for justice, of a kingdom where fear ruled louder than law. Margaret Pole's blood soaked into the Tower Green, but her courage, her lineage, and her memory endured. The Tower of London still stands, its walls scarred by centuries of fear. Tourists walk its stones today, gazing at ravens, at armor, at the glitter of crowns. Few pause long upon the Tower Green, where grass hides the earth that drank the blood of queens and countesses. But if they did, they might hear the echo of Margaret Pole. Not in words, but in silence. The silence of a woman who would not bow her head to the block. The silence of witnesses who watched in horror as an old noblewoman was hacked apart before their eyes. The silence of a king who never dared to speak her name again. Her story endures because it reveals the truth of power without restraint. Margaret was no rebel leading armies, no conspirator plotting in shadows. She was a grandmother, a widow, an aging noble whose only crime was the blood that flowed in her veins. Yet that was enough for Henry VIII, who saw in her the ghost of dynasties long defeated. He sought to erase her, and instead, he immortalized her. The Tudors ruled England for little more than a century. Their splendor dazzled, their intrigues fascinated, their violence scarred. But the Plantagenet name, though stripped of crowns, remained in memory. The death of Margaret Pole became a story told as warning, a tale of what happens when justice is abandoned to the will of one man. Her defiance, even in her final moments, became a testament to human courage. The stones of the tower remember, the grass of the green remembers, and history remembers. Not Henry's fear, nor his power, but the blood of a woman who would not kneel. Margaret Pole's execution was more than a crime. It was a revelation of tyranny. It showed the world how fragile even the mightiest dynasty could be when its throne rested not on justice, but on paranoia. And it left us a question that still lingers, centuries later. When power grows absolute, who among us will have the courage to stand against it?